Hello, my name is Sean Sperry and I am with the IBM Software Group, and in this video we're going to do a short discussion and short overview of the TSM database, TSM6 and DB2, and we're also going to do a short demo of some of the features of using that database and how TSM interfaces with it. So I'd like to get started by just giving you some history of the TSM database. Since its introduction, TSM has always used the database to store metadata about the information it backs up. And in earlier versions of the product, version 5 and below, that database was a proprietary database. It was delivered with TSM. It was installed and managed through the TSM interfaces entirely. It had a bunch of advantages to that, or some advantages to that. It was easy to use, easy to install, small, and very easy to administer. But its limitations were that it was essentially very limited in size, roughly limited to a maximum of 200 to 300 gigabytes per TSM Tivoli Storage Manager instance. Now, the way users dealt with that limitation was to install multiple instances of the TSM server. So if they needed more than 300 gigabytes, they essentially cut another instance of the product. In 2009, our development organization for Tivoli Storage Manager set out to change the database from the proprietary one that was included with the product to DB2. And they wanted to do this for several reasons. They had a lot of new features that they wanted to implement in TSM version 6, such as client node replication and deduplication, which would have increased the database space. They wanted to increase the reliability and performance of the database, and they also wanted to reduce the administrative costs associated with maintaining TSM, and do that by reducing the number of instances that users needed to maintain. And as you can see by the first bullet, they essentially have been able to achieve that, in that as of TSM version 6.4, which is the current version of the product, the database is able to support 4 terabytes per TSM instance. So you can set up a Tivoli Storage Manager environment and essentially be able to maintain many fewer instances than you used to be at version 5. As you're trying to understand and deal with the database as it comes with TSM version 6, however, it does help to understand the design goals of the database and how it differs from standard DB2 that you might go out and implement either in a project that you're developing yourself or with a regular project. DB2 is an enterprise class database, and it essentially has enterprise class complexity associated with it. There are lots of levers and buttons and things you can change with the product and how you can implement it, because it's designed to provide the maximum flexibility and configuration and configurability. There are a large number of design tools, configuration tools, and management tools that ship with DB2, and typically those are run by a database administrator team or a DBA team in an organization, mostly because of the complexity of DB2 and the different ways you can configure it and implement it. Now, for TSM, one of the things that our development organizations wanted to, even though they wanted to increase the size of the database and use a standard database, their design goals were still to try and maintain a lot of the simplicity that came with the previous versions of the TSM database. So what they wanted to do is have it configured and managed by the TSM team instead of by a DBA team. And in order to do that, what they did was very closely tie DB2 that comes with TSM to TSM. So what this essentially means is when you implement TSM, a lot of things about the TSM configuration are preset, pre-configured by development, preordained, if you will, so that you can't change them. So essentially, the DB2 version that you use with a particular version of TSM, the table space design, the container design, the database schema are all prescribed by the TSM development team and fixed. And so you as an administrator really are not allowed to change them. Now the benefits of this are that as a whole you can manage the DB2 database server that's used as a backend for TSM with TSM administration tools as opposed to DB tools, so it tends to be a lot simpler. And also IBM recommends that the database that comes with TSM be typically configured and managed by the storage team as opposed to the DBA team. Now I just want to say, note that if you note that second bullet on the right, DB2 used with TSM, I say on the whole managed with TSM administration tools. There are going to be some cases, perhaps an installation, perhaps when you're doing a SQL query, or perhaps when you're doing some troubleshooting on some particular performance examples where you have to go outside the TSM tools and use the DB2 tools to manage the DB2 database. But as a whole, or on the whole, and as a general rule, you're really tied to DB2 as it's implemented by the TSM developers and configured as it's configured by the TSM development team. So you don't have anywhere near as much of the flexibility and complexity with DB2 used with TSM as you would with straight DB2. So that being said, let's kind of take a look at a few of the components as they're defined to TSM and how TSM sees them. There is the database that is used by TSM, and it contains the metadata information stored in the TSM server, and as we mentioned a little earlier, that can be up to 4 terabytes. TSM maintains an active log which records transactions in progress on the server, which can be up to 128 gig as of version 6.4. And there's also an archive log which is used for point-in-time recovery of the database, and it contains copies of the closed log files from the active log, and it's deleted when a full database backup occurs. Some of the TSM specific commands that are used with the database are query DB space, query log, and backup DB. And in a second we're going to do a demo of those commands and how you might interface with the TSM database using TSM. Now I just want to mention before we get into the demo that we're going to do some future YouTube sessions where we discuss and provide some further information about the sizing of the database, some information about performance of the database, some information about the DB2 tools that you might have to use when you're setting up the database or maybe doing some troubleshooting. And we'll also talk about some troubleshooting, some ways to troubleshoot the TSM server and DB2 if you need to do that in your particular circumstance. As a demo for some of these database components, what we're going to do is look at a TSM server we have here in the lab. And this happens to be Windows 2012. The concepts are somewhat similar or actually very similar if you're using Unix, but we're just using this as a lab server because we happen to have it available. First thing I want to show you is the fact that from a user perspective, I have installed this TSM instance as TSM inst. So that is the user that I'm doing to essentially create directories, look at the instance, start and stop TSM, and that tends to work very well and be the easiest user I have found to do a lot of these operations without having to really go in and manipulate a lot of permissions. So just to take you on a tour of what we have installed here, what I have is split my TSM instance and the database components onto 4 different drives. On my C drive, I have my server 1 directory, which is the name of my instance. I called it that when I did the install and did the instance create. And I created my TSM instance configuration files under TSM server 1. So that's where my dsmserv.opt file is, and startup information, etc. My database I put on E. I only have one database directory here because this is a small lab server in a real production environment. From a performance perspective, you're going to have more than that, but for the purposes of demonstration, that's what we used here. My active log I put in the F drive, so I put in a directory called actlog. And my archive log I put on the G drive, so in a directory called archive log. Now what I'd like to do is look at those from a TSM perspective. This is a version 6.3.4 server, so I am going to use the Operation Center to do this. If you were using an earlier version of TSM, you could use the command line or the tool that you had available, for instance the Admin Center. I'll go ahead and log on as admin and admin. And when I log on to the Operation Center, what I'm going to get first is an overview of the TSM server, clients, services, policies, etc. What I really want to focus on here is the database. So I'm going to go to this side and click on that. And when I do that, you'll see that I'll get an overview of the database components as seen from the Operation Center. So here's my instance, and if I point to those, you'll see that I have a very small server here. So I have a 1 GB database with 23 gig free from a database perspective. For my active log, I have only 93 meg used and 17.9 gig free. And for my archive log, I have 276 meg used and 39.6 gig free. So that's just a quick way to monitor that from a TSM perspective in the Operation Center. I also get information on the last database backup I did, which for me was for only 7 minutes ago, because I did one before I recorded this demonstration. Let me just show you some of the same information from the command line. And again, these are TSM commands, not DB2 commands. I'll do a QDB F equal D for format equals detail, so query database. Here you can see that my database name is TSMDB. That happens to be one of those things that are fixed in TSM. You have no choice about that because that's what development decided the database name was going to be. Here you see some of the information on the size of the database, 25 gig, when it was last backed up, the device class to which it was backed up, etc. Now, I can also do a query DB space and get information about where that database is being stored on my file system. So here you can see my location for my database is /dbdir and the total space allocated to it and the free space. I can also do a qlog and get information on the active log and the archive log. TSM does have the capability to mirror active logs and archive logs. We haven't done that in this instance. Here you see the active log and where I chose to store it, which is f:/actlog, and its size, which is essentially 18 gig, and then the archive log directory, rg:/archive log, and how much data I have free there. Now remember, the archive log will reset when I do a full system backup. So if I were to do a database backup right here, that would reset the archive log. That's kind of the tour, the high-level tour at the TSM level. So what we're going to do is, in some future presentations, talk about some of the commands you can issue to DB2 from a troubleshooting perspective. We'll also talk about some performance recommendations, best practices for performance with DB2 and TSM. And we'll also talk about some troubleshooting that you might do to troubleshoot the TSM server if the database doesn't start or if TSM doesn't start. And we'll also do some talking about database reorg, offline and online reorg. So that concludes this presentation, which is an overview of TSM and DB2. I hope you found it useful.